It's 19 till. Joining us again on the Sunrise Morning Show is Stephen Howard from In Defense of Christians. Stephen, welcome back to the show.
Good morning, Annie. Good to be with you again.
It is good to have you, although what we will be discussing is definitely not good news. In fact, it is tragic news coming out of Ethiopia, a massacre at an Orthodox church earlier this month. Give us the details.
Well, what we know that has been reported, and it's important to note that, it's been reported. A lot of the details here we're still trying to confirm. But what's being reported is that at least 750 people are reported to have been killed after an attack on an Oriental Orthodox church in Egypt's Tigray region. And in particular, the church where the massacre happened was the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum. And this is significant because in Ethiopia, the tradition is that this church actually houses the Ark of the Covenant. And so it is really a center of Christian, really pilgrimage, faith, and practice in Ethiopia. And so the attack, in some sense, you might consider it like akin to a national shrine. Yeah. And so it was a very concerning incident. Again, we're still trying to verify the details of what happened. Much of this has been reported. We do not at all doubt that people were killed. Something awful did happen, but we are trying to amass and gather more information as to who committed the massacre, as well as a total count of those who lost their lives.
Now, I have a few things to ask you in relation to this, with the understanding that nothing is completely definitive at this point. But I think you could probably speak to what has been happening in this Tigray region. There's been a lot of fighting there lately.
There indeed has, and the unfortunate thing is that what we're seeing here is in Ethiopia we're seeing essentially different ethnic groups and different tribes fighting each other, and there's just been no respect for houses of worship, and we've seen for years now actually churches have been targeted in attacks and in raids between different ethnic and religious groups. But I'll even nuance that between people sometimes of the same religion, just attacking a church because it's affiliated with a different tribe or ethnicity. So, even for us, it's a bit of a different phenomenon than what we're seeing even in the Middle East, where we typically work. A vital part of what IDC has always been about is bringing Christians, together because of our shared faith, and that's why it's so concerning to see people of the same, fellow Christians sometimes, doing this to each other, which is a very real problem. I'll also point out, though, at the same time, that there are issues in Ethiopia with the spread of Wahhabism, and that traditionally in Ethiopia, Muslims and Christians have coexisted, for centuries, and we are seeing, an attempt, particularly most people will point to Qatar, to spread Wahhabism throughout Ethiopia, and that is having an impact as well. And that a certain degree, a certain portion of the population is becoming increasingly intolerant and more opposed to the traditional model of coexistence in the country.
Now, you mentioned that this church claims to have the Ark of the Covenant from the Old Testament, where the presence of God was, and housed the Ten Commandments. And there's no, just for listeners' knowledge, there's no definitive church stance on whether or not this is the true Ark of the Covenant that we read about in Scripture. But regardless, this kind of opens up the point that there are ancient Christian roots in this part of the world, correct?
That's absolutely true. We know that Ethiopia adopted Christianity as its state religion in the 4th century. But some of the first disciples of Jesus, were Ethiopian. We know in Acts, we have an Ethiopian eunuch getting baptized. He's considered one of the first evangelizers of the country. We also know that Judaism, obviously as seen by the eunuch in the story, but also just through anthropological evidence, Judaism existed in Ethiopia probably 1,000 years, at least 1,000 years before Christianity was formally introduced. And so even, the kings of the country, the emperors, they called them, really they were identified as being descendants of Solomon, and of King Solomon, that is. So it's very unique, and especially when we look at Eastern Christianity, there's only a number of countries you can point to where the majority of the people are Eastern Christians. You would point to maybe Armenia. You could look at Cyprus. You could look at Lebanon for some time, but Ethiopia is a really shining example. And today it actually stands as the second largest country of Orthodox Christians in the world.
Wow. Now, like I said, no definitive church stance on whether this was the true Ark of the Covenant that is housed at this church. But regardless, is there any indication that is the reason that this particular church was targeted, or simply because it is a place of pilgrimage for many Christians? And do we know, did anything happen to it?
Well, what we know is that what likely happened is that there was a group attempting to raid it and to steal it. And our understanding is that it was taken, it was hidden. The tradition is that, with regards to the Ark, is that it's usually presided over by a priest. That is his ministry. He sits with it in silence and he prays. And what we've read is that during the attack, he and perhaps others took it and hid it. So again, a lot is still quite unclear here at this time. But the attackers were likely looking to steal it.
And just quickly, Stephen, in general, what do you think needs to be done to work toward peace and safety for Christians and really for everyone in this region?
Well, it's a very unique situation, and it is different than many of the other contexts that we're talking about when it comes to Christians being persecuted. Because unfortunately here we have a situation where sometimes Christians are fighting each other because of ethnic differences and tribal differences, and they're specifically targeting, houses of worship that belong to the other groups. And so I think that number one, what we need is just more clear and transparent information. And so I think that's where the U.S. Embassy in Ethiopia can play a constructive role. I would also point to groups like the International Religious Freedom Office at the State Department and the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom here, based in Washington, because certainly there's been attention that's been drawn to Ethiopia, but because of the nuances at play, there hasn't been a laser focus on church attacks and attacks on mosques and other houses of worship. And that's really the next step here, is we need to really put some pressure and really do what we can to protect houses of worship. And really that's even what Pope Francis himself has called for, as he's called for prayers for peace in Ethiopia.
Well, thank you so much for bringing this story to light. We've been talking to Stephen Howard from In Defense of Christians, which is linked at sunrisemorningshow.com. Stephen, really appreciate it.